Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, two of the best examples available of why the Beatles were seen as such a powerhouse in the 60s. In these two albums, you'll find some of the most acclaimed songs to come out of the psychedelic movement, and for years, the discussion of which album was better has been pretty one-sided. Since Sgt. Pepper is seen as one of the best albums ever made, with some articles saying that it's the greatest achievement in the history of music, people are quick to believe that it's the better album. But as of late, there's been a growing number of people that don't agree and see Magical Mystery Tour as a superior album.
There's even a case to be made that like a Magical Mystery Tour has more fire on it, track for track, than Sgt. Pepper's. I'm sorry, but it's true.
Recently, I uploaded a video to this channel talking about the fact that a lot of people seem to believe that Magical Mystery Tour is a better album than Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the response from you guys was amazing. The conversation was all over the place. A lot of people agreed, a lot of people disagreed, and I love when that happens, so I decided to make this video so you guys know my opinion, which album is better, Magical Mystery Tour or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. These albums are extremely complicated to compare because they're both exactly the same and completely different from one another at the same time. You have the same psychedelic, colorful sound, because most of the songs for Magical Mystery Tour were recorded and intended for Sgt. Pepper at a certain point. But then you also have the fact that Sgt. Pepper was very calculated and very precisely crafted to fit a certain narrative or to follow a certain concept. Instead, Magical Mystery Tour wasn't even supposed to be an album. It was an EP with a bunch of songs that were made for the Magical Mystery Tour film, and then on the second half of the album, what made it an LP, it's basically a bunch of singles, some of which were made for Sgt. Pepper, like Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, and then a few other singles that were crafted after Sgt. Pepper was made, like Hello Goodbye and I Am the Walrus. This complicates the conversation because it would be really easy to say that Sgt. Pepper is a lot more cohesive, okay? The album makes more sense. The continuity of the album doesn't really break at any point, except for a few songs. Instead, in Magical Mystery Tour, you're basically listening to a compilation, and it feels like a compilation, okay? The difference in quality from side 1 to side 2 is abysmal, like, it's huge. So how do you do it? How do you compare balance and continuity with enjoyability and quality? How do you factor the influence of Sgt. Pepper in the music industry, not only in the actual music, but in the album cover, the way the album was promoted, the idea of performing with a different name as a different band? Well, the best way to do it, in my opinion, would be pointing out the obvious things of each album, which album has the better track list, which album is more iconic, which album was more influential, which album meant more for the growth of the band as songwriters and as musicians. And obviously, there's always the opinionated factor of the whole conversation, the fact that a lot of people are going to have different opinions because they perceive music differently. But if you're being as objective as possible, I feel like the answer is only one. Allow me to explain. Let's begin with Magical Mystery Tour. I think it's obvious for anyone that enjoys music at any level that Magical Mystery Tour has a way better track list. I mean, we're talking about some of the best psychedelic singles in the discography of the Beatles. Hello Goodbye, Strawberry Fields Forever, which happens to be one of the greatest songs ever made, Penny Lane, an incredibly iconic song by Paul McCartney, I Am the Walrus, you have All You Need Is Love, The Fool on the Hill, which is one of the most covered songs of all time, Blue Jay Way, which is definitely way better of a psychedelic tune than Within You Without You from Sgt. Pepper. I mean, you have an incredible track list, and I recently made a tier list about the Beatles, and I said that the second half of this album, and if you take the whole track list as a whole and you put it in like a blender of quality, this would be an S tier album. It would be, as good as albums like Abbey Road and Revolver and Rubber Soul and the White Album. I really do mean that. You have an incredible track list. The main problem is the fact that this album has almost no continuity because it wasn't even meant to be an album. It was supposed to be a soundtrack. Well, it is a soundtrack for the movie, and the second half is just singles. And I know I said that before, I hate to repeat myself, but it's one of the most important factors in this conversation because the Beatles were known for making albums that made sense, okay? Even in the Beatlemania years, you had A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, albums that were not really examples of the modern album, but were really close to being cohesive and maintaining a mood throughout the whole listen, and once you jump into Rubber Soul, Revolver, you have what it's known to be two of the first concept albums ever made, the birth of the modern album, and then albums like Sgt. Pepper, Pet Sounds, In the Court of the Crimson King, Tommy, and so on and so forth took the idea to another level. So the fact that the songs in Magical Mystery Tour are so disconnected from one another definitely hurt the album quite a bit when it comes to quality. I cannot enjoy an album as much when it doesn't offer any sort of sense to me, and that's the reason why compilation albums by the Eagles and one by the Beatles, the compilation with all of their #1 singles, I don't really enjoy them that much because I feel like it doesn't really do anything for me. It feels like a radio station. So I definitely agree Magical Mystery Tour has way better track lists, but if you're the kind of person who enjoys albums as a whole and enjoys an album that's calculated, cohesive, that feels connected, you're definitely going to have a slight problem with this album, even if the track list is amazing to you. However, Sgt. Pepper doesn't really offer a solution because you do have continuity and obviously the tracks are connected, especially the first few, with this idea that the songs are being performed by the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There's obviously a connection. However, continuity also breaks in this album, not in terms of the sound palette or the content of the song or the pace. They break in terms of quality because there's a few songs in this album that it's not only they're not good, but are borderline annoying. Good Morning being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, When I'm 64, which is a song that I enjoy, but it doesn't really match the color, the energy, the spirit of Sgt. Pepper at all. I mean, you have an album that has thrown some of the greatest songs of all time to you, and then you have Good Morning. I mean, that definitely breaks the journey that is Sgt. Pepper, So even though this album was crafted and conceived as a concept album, and it definitely fits the mold of what a modern album should be, I feel like, this lack of balance in the quality of the album, this constant fluctuation in, the quality from one track to the other hurts the album as well. So it's a problem in both Magical Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper. So, it comes down to preference, which song you prefer the most, the ones in Sgt. Pepper or the ones in Magical Mystery Tour. But to be fully honest, that's the thing that makes this debate so interesting. The fact that it's even a conversation, that the legacy of both of these albums are being compared. I feel like the conversation ends when it comes to the quality and the continuity of the albums. When you jump into legacy, when you jump into influence, significance, and any other factor outside of the track list, in the actual songs, Sgt. Pepper wins in every single category. You cannot compare these two albums. From their conception, from the idea of making this album, Sgt. Pepper was way more interesting of a project. Let's analyze how both of these albums were conceived, what they represented for the band, okay? Sgt. Pepper was basically a way for the Beatles to escape Beatlemania, to escape from being the Beatles. Revolver was a massive success, and there was a lot of people that loved the album, and it was obviously acclaimed by the critics. Everyone knows that. However, there were a lot of fans that were like, this is not really the Beatles we're used to. We don't really like this. Touring was becoming a problem, all the problems they had in the Philippines and in Japan, I think. They also had a bit of turmoil. Being the Beatles had become quite laborious for the band because they were associated with the Beatlemania years and A Hard Day's Night and Meet the Beatles, and all these different albums, and they were trying to move on to better things, to more interesting and complex things. That's when Paul McCartney had the idea of, let's not perform as the Beatles anymore. Let's make a new band, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and that is how the album was born. The main reason the album is so colorful and so different from anything the Beatles had done up until that point, because even though Revolver and Rubber Soul are also psychedelic and, more pop-oriented in their own way, it definitely sounds different from the psychedelia of Sgt. Pepper. It's way more daring, way more straightforward. It's not rock and psychedelic music. It's pure psychedelic music in almost every single song, especially, in songs like A Day in the Life and She's Leaving Home and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And by the way, before anyone says anything stupid in the comments section, I know that John Lennon said that this wasn't a concept album, but John Lennon said a lot of things. He said that Yoko Ono was on par with Paul McCartney when it comes to songwriting ability, so I don't really take John Lennon's words as the most valuable thing ever, okay? Sgt. Pepper is most definitely a concept album. How can it not be? It's known as the first concept album ever made, and if you want to argue that it isn't, then albums like Pet Sounds, Revolver, and a number of other albums, including The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and American Idiot and OK Computer, are not concept albums either, okay? So yes, definitely Sgt. Pepper is a concept album. When it comes to Magical Mystery Tour, the idea was not that exciting. They had a film they made, a psychedelic film that's horrible, by the way. Even if you're a Beatles fan, you're not going to enjoy this film. It's one of the worst things you can watch related to the Beatles, and I mean it. Like, do not watch the Yellow Submarine animation. You're gonna have more fun with that. But that aside, they had this movie they made. They needed a soundtrack for the film, very similar to what they did with A Hard Day's Night and Help, but they didn't need that many songs to make the film, so it was made into an EP in the UK. However, EPs were not really popular in the US, so the label decided to make it into an LP by adding a bunch of singles that were previously released or meant to be released in the future. Once again, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, so on and so forth. That sounds boring. boring as fuck, okay? Because the film is bad, it makes no sense, it was basically a contractual obligation, and the same thing can be said about this idea of adding a bunch of singles to kind of patch up an album. When it comes to influence, I don't even think I need to explain myself. I mean, Sgt. Pepper is one of the most influential works of music, maybe even the most ever released, okay? It's been known in the music scene for quite a while as the greatest achievement in recording history, and there's a reason for that. I mean, people like David Bowie, Lou Reed, Ozzy Osbourne, Robert Plant, and Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, all of them gathered a lot of influence from this album, so definitely it takes the point when it comes to influence. A lot of people say that because it has songs like Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, Magical Mystery Tour is also seen as an influential piece in the music scene, and to an extent that may be true because those songs are almost as influential as Sgt. Pepper, you know, the album. However, you can't really say that Magical Mystery Tour deserves the credit for those two songs because they were released months, I think almost half a year before the album was released, so definitely, you know, the influence comes from the songs, not from the album. And something similar quite happens when you talk about the significance of these albums and the band's growth as songwriters and as musicians overall, you know, because you have to give the point to Sgt. Pepper, because even if this album would have never existed, if Magical Mystery Tour was never released, most of the songs in it would have still been made. I mean, a lot of these songs, especially the best ones, come from the writing and recording sessions for the Sgt. Pepper album, so the growth and, you know, the evolution they got from writing those songs would still be there. It just wouldn't be in an album. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that this conversation only makes sense when you're talking about the quality of the album, when you talk about the actual songs and how good the songs are. When you talk about influence, legacy, how iconic the albums were, how much they helped the Beatles become the greatest band of all time, there's not even a conversation to be had. Sgt. Pepper is way better in almost every single category, and even when you're looking at the songs, Sgt. Pepper is still one of the greatest albums of all time. You know, just because it has a few bad songs, it doesn't mean that the other ones, you know, the ones that are good, the main protagonists of the album, are not some of the greatest songs ever made. Like, once again, A Day in the Life, in my opinion, the greatest song of all time. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Getting Better, She's Leaving Home, Lovely Rita, an incredibly underrated song. I mean, this track list is amazing, and I feel like a lot of people tend to forget how good Sgt. Pepper is, especially when it comes to these sort of conversations. I am the first to say, and I have multiple videos on this channel talking about the overrated legacy of Sgt. Pepper, but that's not me saying that this album is not iconic or that it's not one of the greatest albums of all time. It's just me saying, you know, this album is far from being the best the Beatles have to offer when you have albums like the White Album, Abbey Road, Revolver, Rubber Soul, some of the greatest achievements in the history of music. So that's kind of where the conversation should end, you know, and I'll admit right now, most of the time I rather listening to Magical Mystery Tour over Sgt. Pepper. But if we're talking about which album is the best album, which one was more important, influential, and so on and so forth, there's no other answer than Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. If you say Magical Mystery Tour, you need to pick up a book and read a little bit more about the history of music and how important of a role Sgt. Pepper played in it. So, to answer the question, is Magical Mystery Tour better than Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? It depends on how you pose the question, but overall, absolutely fucking not.
Hey, look at John, will ya?
What's the matter, John, love? Blue meanies?
Newer and bluer meanies have been sighted within the vicinity of this theatre. There's only one way to go out.
How's that? Singing!
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out an album, a song, or an artist, leave it down below and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.